Imagine watching your dive partner suddenly begin convulsing violently right before your eyes at 240 feet depth, in pitch darkness. The regulator flies from their mouth. Their teeth lock shut. And you realize with horror that there is absolutely nothing you can do to save them. This is exactly what happened at Diepolder Sink 2, the deepest underwater cave in the continental United States. On May 11, 1990, 8 members of the Florida Speleological Researchers Group gathered at Sand Hill Scout Camp in Brooksville, Florida. Among them was 25-year-old Lloyd, whose passion for cave diving had already earned him a reputation. Tonight they would dive Diepolder Sink No. 2, reserved only for the most advanced cave divers. For Lloyd, this wasn't just another dive. It was a chance to break a new personal depth record. But in the depths of that underwater cave system, in the crystal-clear waters of a chamber called the ballroom, something would go terribly wrong. And by the time his partner understood what was happening, it would be too late. Sand Hill Scout Camp is located in Hernando County, Florida. When the last Diepolder family member died in the 1970s, the land was donated to the Scouts. What makes this property special is the aquamarine-colored pond that conceals one of North America's most challenging underwater cave systems. Diepolder Sink 2 captured the attention of cave divers worldwide. At a maximum depth of 360 feet, approximately 110 meters, it is the deepest known underwater cave in the continental United States. The entrance is a narrow opening at the bottom of the pond. From there, divers descend 180 feet down a tight vertical shaft, then pass through a turn that opens into the junction room. Beyond that lies the massive ballroom, a chamber so clear that divers describe it as floating in space. Lloyd had only been cave diving for a short time, but his passion was undeniable. Tonight's dive plan was simple. Lloyd and his partner would complete a tour of the ballroom at depths exceeding 200 feet. As they donned their tanks and entered the water, they had no idea that one of them would never return. The descent started smoothly, but as they approached the junction room, they encountered an unpleasant sight. Visibility had dropped to zero. Heavy rains had stirred up sediment inside, creating a complete silt cloud. Still, they had guidelines, so they continued through the muddy junction room and finally emerged into clear water. At one point, a diver experienced a buoyancy problem, quickly resolved, and they continued. But as they descended deeper toward the ballroom, to 250 feet, something began to go wrong with Lloyd. His partner watched as Lloyd briefly released the guideline and began descending faster and deeper than planned. When Lloyd lost contact with the line entirely, he appeared confused, disoriented. His movements became erratic, swaying rapidly as he descended deeper. Lloyd was experiencing nitrogen narcosis, a condition where the nitrogen gas in the air divers breathe creates an intoxication-like effect on the nervous system as they descend to depth. At extreme depths, nitrogen creates a narcotic effect on the brain, impairing judgment and causing confusion. Combined with potential carbon dioxide buildup, Lloyd was essentially getting drunk while trapped underwater. His partner followed him down to the ballroom. In its clear waters, Lloyd seemed to regain control and grabbed the guideline. For a moment, the crisis appeared to be over. Lloyd's partner began his own ascent, believing Lloyd was heading toward the exit. Due to the extreme depths, decompression stops were required. As Lloyd's partner ascended, making the necessary stops, he continuously searched for Lloyd. But Lloyd was neither ahead nor behind him. At the 30-foot stop, real concern began. The partner turned back and searched, but there was no trace of Lloyd. When he finally surfaced, desperately hoping Lloyd would be waiting, he was met with empty air. Lloyd was gone. The alarm was raised. Lloyd's partner and another diver re-entered Diepolder 2 to search. They reached the murky junction room but found nothing. They returned to wait for experts. "17 hours after Lloyd's disappearance, rescue divers entered the cave. It took only 25 minutes to find him. At 241 feet depth, Lloyd's lifeless body was found head down on the cave floor, just feet from the guideline. It took 7 hours to bring his remains to the entrance. The investigation revealed a tragic combination: carbon dioxide buildup and nitrogen narcosis. When Lloyd lost the guideline in poor visibility conditions, the narcosis panicked him further. This increased his breathing, accelerating carbon dioxide buildup, a deadly feedback loop. Eventually, Lloyd lost consciousness, sank to the bottom, and drowned. His mask was still in place, his regulator still in his mouth. He died conscious enough to keep his equipment on, but too disoriented to save himself. Lloyd's death devastated the cave diving community. You might think divers would avoid Diepolder after such a tragedy. But you'd be wrong. The allure of its massive depth and ghostly clear waters proved too powerful, and in less than a decade, the cave would claim another victim in an even more disturbing way. On April 26, 1999, 29-year-old Guido came from Italy. By then, Diepolder No. 2 had strict requirements: proof of cave diving in 5 different systems and at least 100 log dives. Guido's experience qualified him. He planned to write a magazine article about the experience and brought his camera to capture the legendary clear waters. Guido was accompanied by his travel partner, Simone and Sandra, an extremely experienced guide at Diepolder. Around 5 p.m., they completed their paperwork and were equipped with multiple mixed gas tanks. Their dive plan was this: depths approaching 300 feet. At such depths, breathing surface air is incredibly dangerous due to nitrogen narcosis. Divers use gas mixtures with much less nitrogen beyond 100 feet. But divers carry another gas: pure oxygen. It can significantly reduce decompression time. However, and this is critical, pure oxygen can only be used at approximately 20 feet from the surface. When taken deeper, oxygen becomes toxic. The 3 divers entered, descended the 180-foot shaft, passed through the junction room, and reached the ballroom. The ballroom is nearly the size of a basketball court, famous for its beauty and clear waters. Guido was amazed. They rose to the ceiling and moved around, with Guido photographing everything before finally returning to the entrance. Their dive was complete, and they began their return. But the journey would take considerable time due to necessary decompression stops. Divers must stop at various levels, allowing nitrogen to escape safely. A dive computer determines how many stops and for how long. And this is where Guido made a fatal mistake. Among Guido's tanks was a bottle of pure oxygen, but instead of leaving it at the shallow decompression stop, he carried it throughout the entire dive. As they ascended, stopping at 120 feet to decompress, Guido removed the regulator from one tank and replaced it with another. Then he took a deep breath. Instantly, Guido began convulsing uncontrollably. Simone and Sandra lunged toward him, but there was nothing they could do. That single breath, he had accidentally breathed from the pure oxygen tank far beyond the depth where oxygen becomes toxic. There are 2 forms of oxygen toxicity: pulmonary and central nervous system. Central nervous system toxicity is much more sudden and deadly. It begins the moment high oxygen concentrations are breathed beyond toxicity limits. The instant it's inhaled, toxic oxygen damages the brain and spinal cord, triggering a seizure. Underwater, this significantly increases the risk of drowning. As Guido began seizing, the regulator flew from his mouth and his teeth locked. Simone and Sandra desperately tried to reinsert the correct regulator, but his jaw was locked. It was impossible. The only option, bring him to the surface immediately, despite the risk of decompression sickness. They tried, but ascending through the narrow passages with Guido's limp, convulsing body proved too difficult. They had no choice but to leave him. When they surfaced and alerted authorities, rescue divers recovered Guido's body that night. But according to experts, even if they had succeeded, it would have been too late. The moment he breathed pure oxygen at 120 feet, his central nervous system shut down. One mistake, one breath. A 29-year-old who had traveled from the other side of the world was gone. Diepolder Sink. 2 remains open today, but only for the most experienced divers. The deaths of Lloyd and Guido are brutal reminders that even the most beautiful underwater environments can turn deadly in an instant. A moment of disorientation, one wrong breath, and crystal clear waters transform into a tomb. But Diepolder isn't the only cave where rescue attempts have pushed human endurance to absolute limits. In Germany's Riesending Cave, the country's deepest, a researcher became trapped nearly 1,000 meters underground after a rockfall. What followed was one of the most complex and dangerous rescue operations in caving history. Hundreds of rescuers from multiple countries working for over a week in freezing conditions. The question wasn't just whether they could save him, but whether the rescuers themselves would survive. But that's the subject of another video. That's all for now. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to write it in the comments.